The bullet missed Grace Brennan's head by inches, splintering the wooden post behind her as she dropped to her knees behind a wagon wheel, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. It was August 1873 in Concord, California, and the bank robbery happening across the dusty street had turned the quiet Tuesday morning into chaos. Grace had only come into town to pick up fabric for her boarding house curtains, and now she was trapped between the mercantile and certain death, watching armed men pour out of the Concord savings and loan with bags of money and murder in their eyes. She pressed herself against the wagon, willing herself to become invisible, when she heard the thunder of hooves and saw a rider come around the corner at a speed that seemed reckless even for the circumstances. The man on the horse moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle, his dark hair whipping behind him as he drew his revolver with practiced ease. He fired twice, and two of the robbers dropped their bags, clutching their shoulders. The remaining three scattered like roaches when a lamp gets lit, one heading directly toward Grace's hiding spot. Before she could scream, the rider was there, his horse sliding to a stop in a cloud of dust. He swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion and planted himself between Grace and the advancing outlaw. The robber raised his pistol, but the cowboy was faster, disarming the man with a swift kick that sent the weapon spinning into the dirt. A solid punch to the jaw, and the outlaw crumpled like a rag doll. The whole thing had taken maybe 30 seconds, but to Grace, it felt like an eternity compressed into a handful of heartbeats. The cowboy turned to her, extending a gloved hand, his blue eyes scanning her face with genuine concern. "Are you hurt, madam?" His voice was deep and warm, with just a hint of a Texas drawl that softened the edges of his words. Grace took his hand, her legs shaking as she stood. "I'm fine, thank you. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." He gave her a slight smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "Just doing what needed doing. Name's Benjamin Irwin. Most folks call me Ben. Grace Brennan." She brushed the dust from her green calico dress, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "You're not the new deputy everyone's been talking about, are you? Guilty as charged." He retrieved his hat from where it had fallen during the scuffle, settling it back on his head. "Just arrived in Concord 3 days ago. Been meaning to introduce myself to the townsfolk in a more civilized manner, but it seems fate had other plans." The sheriff, a portly man named Harold Winters, came huffing down the street with several armed citizens. They rounded up the robbers, and Ben gave his statement with an economy of words that impressed Grace. He didn't embellish or boast, just stated the facts as plainly as if he were describing the weather. When the excitement died down and the crowd began to disperse, Grace found herself still standing there, watching Ben check his horse for injuries. The animal, a magnificent bay gelding with intelligent eyes, nuzzled his owner's shoulder affectionately. "That's quite a horse," Grace said, moving closer. "This is Ranger. Had him since he was a colt. We've been through a lot together." Ben stroked the horse's neck with obvious affection. "He's saved my life more times than I care to count." Grace hesitated, then said, "I run a boarding house at the edge of town. The big white one with the green shutters. If you're looking for a more permanent place to stay than the hotel, I have a room available. Good meals included, and the price is fair." Ben looked at her with those steady blue eyes, and Grace felt something shift in her chest, like the tumblers of a lock falling into place. "I'd like that," he said simply. "When can I move in?" "Anytime you'd like. I'll be heading back there now if you want to follow and see the place." They walked together through the town, Ben leading Ranger by the reins, and Grace carrying the fabric she'd somehow managed to hold onto through the entire ordeal. She found herself very aware of his presence beside her, the way he moved with quiet confidence, the set of his shoulders, the gentleness with which he handled his horse. She'd been running the boarding house for 2 years since her father died, and she'd gotten used to being alone, to handling everything herself. But there was something about this man that made her feel like maybe she didn't have to carry everything by herself. The boarding house was indeed white with green shutters, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and a well-tended garden that Grace took pride in. She showed Ben the room on the 2nd floor, the corner one with windows facing both the road and the hills beyond. It was clean and spacious, with a comfortable bed, a washstand, and a desk near the window. "Meals are at 7 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening," Grace explained. "I ask that boarders keep their rooms tidy and respectful of quiet hours after 9 at night. There's a stable out back for Ranger with fresh hay and water." Ben set his saddlebags on the bed and looked around the room with approval. "This is perfect, Miss Brennan. Much better than I expected. Please call me Grace, and I'll get supper started. You must be hungry after all that excitement." She left him to settle in and went downstairs to her kitchen, her sanctuary and the heart of the house. Grace had always found peace in cooking, in the rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring pots, the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into something nourishing and delicious. Tonight she made beef stew with fresh bread, nothing fancy but solid and satisfying. Her only other boarder, an elderly widow named Mrs. Margaret Patterson, joined them for supper. The old woman was delightful company, full of stories about Concord's history and the changes she'd witnessed over her 73 years. Ben proved to be an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions and laughing at Margaret's more humorous anecdotes. After Margaret retired for the evening, Grace and Ben lingered at the table, and she found herself asking, "What brought you to Concord? It's not exactly a booming metropolis." Ben traced the rim of his coffee cup with one finger, considering his answer. "I've spent the last 10 years drifting from town to town, taking jobs as a deputy or hired gun, never staying anywhere long. After a while, all those places started blending together. I realized I was living but not really having a life, if that makes sense. When I heard Concord needed a deputy and that it was a peaceful town with good people, I thought maybe it was time to try putting down roots." "Do you have family anywhere?" Grace asked, then quickly added, "I'm sorry if that's too personal." "Not at all. My parents died of fever when I was 17. Had a younger sister, Sarah, but she passed during childbirth 5 years ago. Her husband and baby died too. After that, I didn't have much reason to stay in one place." The pain in his voice was old but still real, like a scar that aches when the weather changes. Grace reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "I'm so sorry, Ben. That's a lot of loss to carry." "What about you?" he asked gently. "You mentioned your father passed 2 years ago." Heart gave out while he was working in the garden. "My mother died when I was 12, so it's just been me since then. Father left me this house and a little money, enough to get the boarding house started. It's a good life, mostly. I have friends in town and I keep busy." She didn't mention the loneliness that sometimes crept in late at night, or how she sometimes wondered if this was all there would ever be. They talked until the candles burned low, sharing stories and discovering unexpected common ground. Both loved early mornings and good horses. Both had read more books than most people they knew. Both believed in helping others but had been let down enough times to be cautious about trusting too quickly. When Ben finally excused himself to get some rest, Grace cleaned up the kitchen with a lightness in her step that surprised her. She told herself it was just nice to have someone interesting to talk to. Nothing more. But as she lay in bed that night, she kept seeing those blue eyes and that slight smile, and her heart beat just a little faster. Ben settled into the boarding house and into Concord itself with surprising ease. His duties as deputy kept him busy, but not overwhelmed. Concord was indeed a peaceful town, its main problems being the occasional drunk cowboy or dispute between neighbors. Ben handled everything with a calm authority that quickly earned him respect. He was fair but firm, never using more force than necessary, always giving people a chance to make things right before resorting to jail time. Grace watched him from a distance at first, noticing how children followed him on the street, how he always had time to help an elderly person cross the muddy road or carry heavy parcels. He attended church on Sundays, sitting in the back pew with his hat in his hands, his voice a pleasant baritone during hymns. After services, women fluttered around him like moths to a flame, but Ben remained polite and distant, never encouraging their attentions. At the boarding house, he was an ideal tenant. His room stayed neat, he was always on time for meals, and he often helped with small repairs without being asked. Grace came home one afternoon to find him fixing the wobbly porch railing that she'd been meaning to get to for weeks. "You don't have to do that," she protested, setting down her shopping basket. Ben looked up from his work, a nail between his lips. He removed it and said, "I know. But it needed doing and I had the time. Besides, you do so much for everyone else. Seems only fair someone does something for you." It was such a simple statement, but it hit Grace squarely in the chest. When was the last time someone had noticed that she needed help? When had anyone thought to make her life easier without expecting something in return? "Thank you," she managed, her voice slightly unsteady. "That's very kind." They fell into a comfortable routine over the following weeks. Ben would leave for work early, often before Grace started breakfast, but he'd return for the noon meal without fail. They'd talk about their mornings, sharing small details about their days that somehow felt significant. In the evenings, after supper, they often sat on the porch while the sun set, painting the California hills in shades of gold and purple. Margaret noticed, of course. The old woman might have been elderly, but her mind was sharp as ever. One afternoon, while helping Grace with the mending, she said casually, "That Benjamin Irwin is a fine man." "He's a good boarder," Grace replied neutrally, focusing intently on the sock she was darning. "I've lived a long time, dear girl, and I know what I see. That man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars, and unless I'm much mistaken, you look at him the same way." Grace set down her needlework, her cheeks warming. "Margaret, it's not like that, we're just friends. Ememhum, and I'm the Queen of England." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Grace, you're young and lovely, and you've been alone too long. There's no shame in caring for someone, in wanting companionship. Your father, God rest his soul, would want you to be happy. What if I'm misreading things? What if he's just being friendly because I'm his landlady?" Margaret laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "Oh, sweetheart, men don't look at their landladies the way Ben looks at you, I promise you that. And they certainly don't find excuses to be near them every chance they get." Grace wanted to argue, but deep down, she'd noticed those things too. The way Ben's face lit up when she entered a room, how he always saved the seat beside him at supper, even though they had plenty of space. The gentle way he spoke to her, as if every word mattered. And if she was honest with herself, she knew her own feelings had grown far beyond simple friendship or landlady concern. September arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the promise of autumn. The town prepared for the annual Harvest Festival, a weekend celebration with contests, dancing, and general merrymaking. Grace had always enjoyed the festival, but this year she found herself hoping Ben would ask her to attend with him. He did, though not in the way she expected. It was a Thursday evening, and they were sitting on the porch as usual, watching bats swoop through the twilight hunting insects. Ben was quieter than normal, his coffee cooling untouched in his cup. "Something on your mind?" Grace asked gently. Ben turned to look at her, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression, an uncertainty that she'd never seen before. "Grace, I want to ask you something, but I'm not quite sure how to go about it." Her heart began to race. "You can ask me anything." He took a deep breath. "Would you allow me to court you? Properly, I mean. I'd like to take you to the Harvest Festival not as friends, but as a man courting a woman he admires greatly. If you're not interested, I understand completely, and I promise it won't make things awkward. I'll continue being your boarder and friend, and we'll never speak of it again. But I had to ask because the thought of not trying, of letting this chance pass by, well, that seems like the worst kind of cowardice." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears that she tried to blink away. "I thought you'd never ask." "Yes, Ben. Yes, I'd very much like that." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, brilliant and warm and full of promise. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, his calloused palm rough against her fingers but infinitely gentle. They sat like that for a long while, not needing words, just the comfortable silence of two people who'd found something rare and precious. The night of the Harvest Festival arrived with clear skies and a full moon that hung over Concord like a lantern. Grace wore her best dress, a deep blue muslin with white lace at the collar and cuffs that she'd made herself. She'd never been vain, but she couldn't help hoping Ben would think she looked pretty. When she came downstairs, Ben was waiting in the front hall, and the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. He wore dark trousers and a white shirt under a black vest, his hair neatly combed, his boots polished. He looked impossibly handsome, and Grace had to remind herself to breathe. "You look beautiful," he said softly, "like something out of a painting." "You clean up pretty well yourself, Deputy Irwin." He offered his arm, and they walked into town together, the warmth of early evening surrounding them like a blanket. The festival was in full swing, with lanterns strung between buildings and musicians tuning their instruments in the town square. The air smelled of roasted corn and apple pie, wood smoke and dried hay. Children ran past shrieking with laughter, and everywhere Grace looked, she saw her neighbors enjoying themselves. Ben bought them plates of food from various vendors, and they sampled everything from honey cakes to barbecued beef to fresh peach cobbler. They watched the pie eating contest, laughing when Sheriff Winters ended up with blueberry stains all over his mustache. They tried their hand at the ring toss, and Ben won Grace a small carved wooden bird that she immediately treasured. When the dancing started, Ben led her to the wooden platform that served as a makeshift dance floor. Grace had danced before, at previous festivals and the occasional social, but never had it felt like this. Ben held her with confident gentleness, guiding her through the steps of a waltz with practiced ease. They moved together naturally, as if they'd been dancing together for years instead of minutes. "Where did you learn to dance so well?" Grace asked, slightly breathless. "My mother insisted on teaching me. She said a gentleman should know how to treat a lady, and that included dancing." His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "I complained at the time, but I'm grateful now." They danced through several songs, fast and slow, barely noticing when other couples came and went around them. Grace felt like she was floating, suspended in a perfect moment that she wanted to last forever. When the musicians finally took a break, Ben suggested a walk to cool down, and they strolled to the edge of the festival grounds where the noise faded to a pleasant hum. They ended up by the creek that ran along Concord's western border, its water dark and smooth as glass under the moonlight. Ben found a fallen log that made a decent bench, and they sat side by side, their shoulders touching. "I haven't had a night this perfect in longer than I can remember," Ben said quietly. "Maybe never." "Me neither," Grace admitted. "I was starting to think maybe this wasn't in the cards for me. A boarding house owner isn't exactly the most romantic figure." Ben turned to face her fully. "Grace Brennan, you are one of the most remarkable women I've ever known. You're strong and kind and capable. You've built a good life for yourself from loss and hardship. You make everyone around you feel welcome and cared for. You're smart and funny, and when you laugh, it's like music. The fact that you run a boarding house doesn't define you. It's just one small part of who you are." Grace felt tears threatening again. "How do you do that? How do you always know exactly what to say? I'm just telling you what I see. What I've seen since that first day when you offered me a room. I think part of me started falling for you right then, standing in the street covered in dust, looking at this brave woman who'd just been shot at but was still thinking about being hospitable to a stranger." "I was terrified," Grace confessed. "My hands didn't stop shaking for an hour. But you didn't let it break you. That's courage, real courage. Not the absence of fear, but doing what needs doing despite it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the creek and the distant sounds of the festival, content in each other's presence. The courtship progressed naturally from that night. Ben continued living at the boarding house, but now there was an acknowledged understanding between them. He courted her properly, never overstepping bounds of propriety, but making his intentions clear. He brought her wildflowers he picked on his morning rides. He read to her from the newspaper while she cooked. He accompanied her to church and town socials, always attentive, always respectful. Margaret watched their courtship with grandmotherly approval, occasionally offering advice drawn from her own long marriage. She told Grace stories about her late husband, about the importance of laughter and communication, of choosing kindness even during disagreements. As October arrived with its cooler temperatures and changing leaves, Grace realized she was happier than she'd ever been. Her days had purpose and joy, each moment brighter for knowing Ben was part of her life. They developed their own private language, small gestures and looks that spoke volumes. A smile across the dinner table, a gentle touch on the arm when passing in the hallway. The comfortable silence of two people who didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. But Grace also felt a growing restlessness, a question that lodged itself in her heart and wouldn't leave. Ben had said he wanted to put down roots in Concord, but what did that really mean? He'd spent 10 years drifting, never settling anywhere. Was she just another temporary stop, a pleasant interlude before the wanderlust called him away again? The thought terrified her because she knew with absolute certainty that she was in love with him, deeply and completely. And the idea of losing him felt like contemplating her own death. She tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the present instead of worrying about the future. But the question grew louder, more insistent, until she knew she had to ask or go mad from wondering. The opportunity came on a Sunday afternoon in late October. They'd gone for a ride into the hills, something they did most weekends when Ben wasn't working. The weather was perfect, cool but sunny, with a breeze that carried the scent of dried grass and sage. They'd brought a picnic lunch that Grace had packed, and they found a spot overlooking a valley, the view stretching for miles. After they ate, they lay back on the blanket, watching clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky. Grace gathered her courage, her heart pounding so hard she thought Ben must surely hear it. "Can I ask you something?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Anything," Ben said, turning his head to look at her. Grace took a deep breath. "Do you ever think about settling down? I mean really settling, not just renting a room, but having a real home, a family, all of that." Ben was quiet for a moment, and Grace's stomach knotted with anxiety. Had she pushed too hard, too soon? Were they not at that stage yet? Then Ben sat up and turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. His expression was serious but soft, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Grace, I already have," he said simply. "With you?" She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "I already have settled down. The moment you took a chance on a stranger and offered him a room, the moment we started talking and I realized I'd found someone truly special, that was it for me. I'm not going anywhere. This is home now." "Your home?" Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks before she could stop them. "But you spent so long moving around. How can you be sure?" Ben reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumbs, cradling her face in his hands. "Because for the first time in 10 years, I wake up excited for the day ahead. Because I can imagine next year and 5 years and 20 years from now, and you're in every single one of those pictures. Because when I think about the future, it's not scary or empty anymore. It's full of possibility and all of it centers around you." "Ben," she whispered, overwhelmed by the emotion flooding through her. "I love you, Grace Brennan. I've loved you for weeks now, maybe from that very first day. I know we haven't been courting long and I don't want to rush you, but I need you to know that I'm serious about this, about us. I want to marry you, build a life with you, grow old with you, if you'll have me." Grace laughed through her tears, joy bubbling up inside her like champagne. "Yes. Yes, of course, yes. I love you too, so much it sometimes scares me." Ben pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She could feel his heart beating, rapid and strong, matching her own. When he finally pulled back, he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was Grace's first kiss, and it was perfect, everything she'd ever imagined and more. They stayed in the hills until the sun began to set, talking about their future in concrete terms now. Ben wanted to save money for a house of their own, somewhere with land for horses and maybe some chickens. Grace wanted children, at least 2 or 3 if they were blessed. They discussed wedding plans, deciding on a simple ceremony in the spring, giving them time to prepare and save. When they rode back to town as twilight fell, Grace felt like she was living in a dream. Everything had changed in the span of an afternoon, her future suddenly bright and clear and beautiful beyond measure. Margaret was waiting on the porch when they returned, and she took one look at their glowing faces and knew immediately what had happened. She pulled them both into fierce hugs, tears of happiness streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I'm so happy for you both," she said. "You deserve every bit of joy life can give you." That evening, after Margaret retired, Grace and Ben sat on the porch like always, but everything felt different now. They were engaged, promised to each other, building something real and lasting. Ben had moved to sit on the porch swing beside Grace instead of the separate chair he usually occupied, and she leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders. "We should tell people tomorrow," Grace said. "The whole town will know within hours anyway once we tell anyone." Ben chuckled. "True enough. Small-town gossip is faster than the telegraph. Are you sure about this?" Grace asked, a last flicker of doubt surfacing. "About me, about staying in Concord." Ben tilted her face up to look at him. "Grace, I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life. You are my future, my home, my heart. I'm not going anywhere except wherever you are." She kissed him then, initiating it herself this time, pouring all her love and trust and hope into it. When they finally parted, both were breathless and smiling. "Spring can't come fast enough," Grace murmured. "We could do it sooner," Ben suggested. "I don't need a big wedding, I just need you." Grace considered it. "What about December? After the first of the year. That gives us a few months to prepare, but it's not so long that I'll go crazy waiting." "December it is," Ben agreed. The start of a new year and a new life together. They spread the news the next day as planned, and the town's reaction was universally positive. Grace's friends were thrilled for her, throwing an impromptu engagement celebration at the church social hall. Ben's fellow lawmen clapped him on the back and teased him good-naturedly about being domesticated. Even the grumpy clerk at the general store offered his congratulations. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Grace sewed her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation in ivory silk with seed pearl buttons. Margaret helped with the alterations, her expert stitching ensuring everything fit perfectly. They cleaned the boarding house from top to bottom, Grace wanting everything perfect for when she and Ben officially became husband and wife. Ben worked extra hours to save money, taking on odd jobs around town in addition to his deputy duties. He was determined to give Grace the security she deserved, to make sure they started their marriage on solid footing. He also spent time fixing up the house, painting the shutters, repairing the front steps, replacing several cracked windows. He wanted Grace to know that he saw the boarding house as their home, not just temporary lodging. In November, Ben surprised Grace with a ring he'd had made at the jeweler's shop in Sacramento. It was a simple gold band with a small but beautiful sapphire that matched her eyes. When he slipped it onto her finger, Grace cried happy tears and kissed him until they were both dizzy. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect." "Far from it," Ben replied. "But I promise I'll spend every day trying to be the man you deserve." As their wedding day approached, Grace found herself reflecting on the strange and wonderful path that had led her here. If someone had told her in August that by December she'd be marrying a man she'd only met a few months ago, she would have laughed in disbelief. But with Ben, everything had fallen into place with a rightness she couldn't deny. It wasn't rushed or reckless. It was simply two people recognizing what they'd found and having the courage to reach for it. The night before the wedding, Margaret insisted on Grace staying in her room, declaring it bad luck for the bride and groom to see each other. Grace complied, though she slept poorly, too excited and nervous for real rest. She kept touching the ring on her finger, reassuring herself that this was real, that tomorrow she would become Mrs. Benjamin Irwin. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the December morning crisp with the promise of winter. Grace dressed with Margaret's help, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the pearl buttons. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked radiant, glowing from within with happiness and love. The ceremony was held in the Concord church, a small white building with a steeple that could be seen from anywhere in town. Grace had worried that few people would attend on such short notice and in the cold, but the pews were packed. It seemed the entire town had turned out to witness their union. Grace walked down the aisle alone, having no father to give her away, but she didn't feel lonely. Her friends' smiling faces surrounded her, and at the end of the aisle stood Ben, looking more handsome than she'd ever seen him in his Sunday best. His eyes locked on hers with such love that she felt her heart might burst. The Reverend, an elderly man named Thomas Wright, who'd known Grace since childhood, performed the ceremony with warmth and humor. He spoke about love and commitment, about building a life together through good times and bad, about the sacred bond of marriage. When it came time for the vows, Both Grace and Ben spoke clearly, their voices steady and sure. "I, Benjamin Irwin, take you, Grace Brennan, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, cherish you, and protect you for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, as long as we both shall live. I, Grace Brennan, take you, Benjamin Irwin, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, cherish you, and stand by your side for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, as long as we both shall live." When Reverend Wright pronounced them man and wife, and told Ben he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was both chaste and passionate, appropriate for their audience but hinting at the depth of feeling between them. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, and Grace and Ben walked back down the aisle together, married, united, beginning their new life. The reception was held at the boarding house, with tables set up in the large front room and dining area. Townspeople had contributed food, creating a feast that rivaled any fancy restaurant. There was roast chicken and beef, fresh bread and butter, vegetables prepared a dozen different ways, and enough desserts to satisfy the sweetest tooth. Someone had brought a fiddle, and soon music filled the air, people dancing and laughing and celebrating. Grace danced with Ben, with Sheriff Winters, with old Mr. Henderson from the bank, with anyone who asked. But her eyes kept returning to her husband, this good man who'd ridden into her life on a dusty August morning and changed everything. Every time their gazes met across the room, she felt a thrill of joy and disbelief that this was real, that he was truly hers. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, offering final congratulations and well wishes, Ben and Grace stood on the porch, waving goodbye. Margaret had already retired, giving them privacy, and soon they were alone in their home, married together. Ben turned to Grace and swept her into his arms, carrying her over the threshold despite her laughing protests that they were already inside. He carried her up the stairs to what would now be their shared room, the larger one that had been Grace's since childhood. That night they consummated their marriage with tenderness and passion, learning each other in the most intimate way possible. Grace had been nervous, but Ben was patient and gentle, making sure she felt safe and loved. Afterward they lay tangled together in the bed, Grace's head on Ben's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Happy?" Ben asked, stroking her hair. "Happier than I knew was possible," Grace replied honestly. "This morning I was Grace Brennan, spinster boarding house owner. Tonight I'm Grace Irwin, married woman. It's almost too much to process." "You'll always be Grace to me," Ben said. "The woman I fell in love with, brave and kind and beautiful. The name is just paperwork. What's in here?" He placed his hand over her heart. "That's what matters." Grace propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "How did I get so lucky? How did you end up in Concord of all places?" "I think we were meant to find each other," Ben said simply. "I spent 10 years wandering and every step was leading me here to you. I don't believe in much, but I believe in that." They made love again, slower this time, savoring each touch and kiss, and then fell asleep in each other's arms, exhausted and content and perfectly happy. The first months of marriage were an adjustment but a joyful one. Grace had lived alone for so long that having someone else to consider took getting used to. But Ben was an easy partner, willing to compromise and communicate, never demanding or unreasonable. They developed routines and rhythms, learning each other's quirks and preferences. Ben continued his work as deputy, and Grace continued running the boarding house with his help. They made a good team, each contributing their strengths to building their life together. Margaret remained their only long-term boarder, and she proved invaluable, helping with household tasks and providing wisdom when needed. She became like the grandmother neither of them had, loving and supportive and occasionally meddling in the best possible way. In March, Grace realized she'd missed her monthly courses. At first, she dismissed it as stress or a fluke, but when she missed a second month and began feeling queasy in the mornings, she couldn't deny the truth. She was pregnant. She told Ben one evening after supper, nervous despite knowing he wanted children. They were sitting on the porch, enjoying the first truly warm evening of spring, when she simply blurted it out. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." Ben's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, then pure joy. He let out a whoop of excitement and pulled Grace into a fierce hug, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We're having a baby. Grace, this is incredible." "You're incredible." "You're not worried," Grace asked, "about the timing or the money or anything?" "Not even a little bit," Ben said firmly. "We'll figure it all out. We're having a baby, Grace, our baby. That's a blessing, not a problem." They told Margaret that same evening, and the old woman was beside herself with happiness. She immediately began knitting tiny blankets and booties, declaring that every baby needed handmade items to welcome them into the world. Grace found herself surrounded by love and support, the whole town seeming to share in her joy when word got out. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Grace experienced more morning sickness than she would have liked. Ben was attentive and caring, fetching her dry crackers when she felt nauseous, rubbing her feet when they swelled, reading to her from the newspaper or books when she was too tired to do it herself. As her belly grew, Grace sometimes looked at herself in the mirror with wonder. She was creating life, a tiny person who was part her and part Ben, their love made manifest. The baby kicked vigorously, especially at night, and Ben would place his hand on her stomach and talk to their child, telling stories and making promises. "We're going to love you so much," he'd say. "You're going to have the best mama in the world, and I'm going to do everything I can to be the daddy you deserve. We're going to teach you to ride horses and read books and be kind to everyone you meet." In early November, nearly a year after their wedding, Grace went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Ben paced outside the bedroom where the midwife and Margaret attended Grace, his worry evident in every line of his body. He'd faced down outlaws without flinching, but the sound of Grace in pain nearly broke him. Finally, as the sun climbed toward noon, he heard a new sound, the sharp, indignant cry of a newborn baby. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Dorothy Harris, opened the door with a smile. "You have a son, Deputy Irwin, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is tired but well." Ben didn't remember climbing the stairs or entering the room. Suddenly, he was just there, at Grace's bedside, looking down at her exhausted but radiant face and the tiny bundle in her arms. The baby had stopped crying and was looking around with unfocused dark blue eyes, his little fists waving in the air. "Meet your son," Grace said softly, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "I was thinking we could name him Joseph, after my father, Joseph Benjamin Irwin." "It's perfect," Ben whispered, unable to take his eyes off his son. "He's perfect. You're perfect. Grace, I don't have words for what I'm feeling right now." She shifted the baby so Ben could hold him, and Ben took his son with shaking hands, afraid he'd break something so small and precious. But Joseph settled against his father's chest like he belonged there, tiny fingers curling around one of Ben's. "Hello, Joseph," Ben said. "I'm your papa. I've been waiting to meet you." Grace watched her husband with their son, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. This was everything she'd ever wanted, and things she hadn't known to dream of. A husband who loved her completely. A beautiful, healthy baby. a home filled with warmth and laughter. She thought back to that day in August when bullets were flying and a stranger on a horse had changed her life forever. She'd never imagined then that less than 2 years later, she'd be here, in this perfect moment. Margaret came in shortly after, having given them a few minutes alone as a family. She cooed over baby Joseph, declaring him the most handsome baby she'd ever seen, though she'd said the same about every baby born in Concord for the last 50 years. "You two have created something beautiful," she said, tears in her eyes. "Not just this precious boy, but the life you're building together. Your love is the kind that inspires others, that makes people believe in good things." The first weeks with a newborn were challenging in ways Grace hadn't anticipated. Joseph was a good baby overall, but he woke frequently to nurse, leaving Grace exhausted. Ben helped as much as he could, walking with Joseph when he was fussy, changing nappies and doing extra chores so Grace could rest. He took a week off from his deputy duties, and Sheriff Winters was understanding, having raised 5 children himself. As the weeks turned into months, they found their rhythm as parents. Joseph thrived, growing chubby and alert, beginning to smile and coo. Grace had never known love like this, the fierce protective adoration she felt for her son. And watching Ben with Joseph only deepened her love for her husband. He was a natural father, patient and playful, singing silly songs and making funny faces to coax smiles from their baby. By the time Joseph turned 6 months old, Grace knew she wanted more children. The boarding house rang with laughter and life in a way it never had before, and she wanted to fill it even more. She and Ben had talked about having several children, building the kind of family neither of them had grown up with. When she approached Ben about trying for another baby, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her soundly. "I think that sounds perfect. Our son needs siblings to play with, and I want a house full of children if we're blessed enough to have them." Life settled into a beautiful pattern over the following year. Ben continued his work as deputy, becoming well respected throughout the county. He was offered the position of sheriff when Winters retired, but he turned it down, preferring to remain deputy. The position gave him enough to provide for his growing family without requiring the political maneuvering that came with being sheriff. Grace ran the boarding house with efficiency and warmth. She'd gained a reputation for excellent meals and comfortable accommodations, and she always had people wanting rooms. She kept it to just a few boarders at a time, though, not wanting to be too busy for her family. Margaret remained a constant presence, having become so integrated into their lives that she was essentially Joseph's grandmother. When Joseph was 14 months old, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, with less sickness and more energy. She carried differently too, the baby sitting lower, and the midwife predicted it might be a girl this time. In June of 1876, Grace gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Anna Margaret Irwin, the middle name honoring the woman who'd become family to them. Anna had Grace's features but Ben's blue eyes, and from the moment she was born, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. Joseph adapted well to being a big brother, showing surprising gentleness with the new baby. He'd sit beside Grace while she nursed Anna, patting the baby's head carefully and telling her about his wooden horse and other important things. Ben looked at his family, his wife and 2 children, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. He'd gone from being alone and adrift to having roots deeper than he'd thought possible. Every day he woke up thankful for the life he'd built, for the woman who'd given him a home and purpose. 2 years later, their family grew again with the birth of twin boys, David and Samuel. The pregnancy had been difficult, Grace growing enormous with the 2 babies, and the birth was complicated enough that it scared both her and Ben. But mother and babies came through it safely, and suddenly, their family had doubled in size. The boarding house, while spacious, began to feel crowded with 4 young children. Ben and Grace started seriously discussing building a new home, something bigger with room for their growing family and maybe a few more children if they were blessed. They found land just outside of town, 5 acres with a creek running through it and views of the hills. Ben bought it with money he'd been carefully saving, and they began planning their dream home. They wanted something substantial but not ostentatious, with bedrooms for all the children, a large kitchen for Grace, a study for Ben, and a wraparound porch where they could watch sunsets together. Construction began in the spring of 1879, with Ben doing much of the work himself with help from friends and hired carpenters. It took nearly a year, but by early 1880, their new house was complete. It was beautiful. 2 stories of painted white wood with a red roof, green shutters that Grace had insisted on, and that promised wraparound porch. There was a barn for horses, a chicken coop that was already occupied, and plenty of space for the children to run and play. The day they moved in, Grace stood in the front yard, 7-year-old Joseph chasing 5-year-old Anna while the 2-year-old twins toddled after them, and felt tears of joy streaming down her face. This was theirs, truly theirs, a home they'd built together through hard work and love. Ben came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Happy, beyond words," Grace replied, leaning back against him. "Thank you for giving me this, for being the man you are, for choosing me." "I think we chose each other," Ben said. "And I'd make the same choice every single day for the rest of my life." They kept the boarding house, hiring a manager to run it and providing them with steady income while Grace focused on raising their children. Margaret moved into the new house with them, taking a comfortable room on the first floor, and declaring that she was too old to be living alone anyway. The years passed in a blur of happiness and chaos, of scraped knees and childhood illnesses, of school pageants and birthday parties, of quiet moments stolen on the porch after the children were asleep. Grace and Ben grew older together, silver threading through their hair, laugh lines deepening around their eyes, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by the trials they'd weathered together and the life they'd built. Joseph grew into a serious, responsible young man who wanted to study law. Anna was spirited and adventurous, riding horses like she'd been born in the saddle. The twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into mischief that would have driven Grace mad if it weren't so amusing. In 1882, Grace had one more surprise pregnancy at the age of 32. She'd thought they were done having children, but life had other plans. This time she gave birth to another daughter, whom they named Ruth. She was a quiet, gentle child from the beginning, content to sit and watch the world around her with wise, dark eyes. Ben, now 40 years old, declared that 5 children were enough to keep them busy for several lifetimes. Grace agreed, though part of her would have welcomed as many children as came. She loved being a mother, loved the noise and energy of a full house, loved watching Ben with their children, and seeing the kind of father she'd known he'd be. Margaret lived to see all 5 children reaching school age before passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 92 in the summer of 1884. Her death hit the family hard, especially Grace, who'd come to rely on the older woman's wisdom and companionship. They buried her in the Concord cemetery under a large oak tree, and Grace visited her grave weekly, bringing fresh flowers and sharing news about the children. The boarding house continued to provide income, though they'd never needed it desperately. Ben had been smart with money, investing wisely and making sure his family would be secure even if something happened to him. But nothing did. He stayed healthy and strong, still working as deputy well into his 50s, still the man people called when they needed help or advice. The children grew and thrived. Joseph went east to study law at a prestigious university, making his parents proud. Anna shocked everyone by deciding to become a teacher, taking a position at the Concord school. The twins took over management of the boarding house when they were old enough, proving to have a head for business. Ruth, the baby, showed artistic talent, her drawings and paintings decorating every wall of the house. Through it all, Grace and Ben remained each other's constant. They still sat on the porch most evenings, watching the sun set over the hills. They still talked for hours about everything and nothing. They still held hands when they walked through town. They still kissed like newlyweds when they thought no one was watching. On their 25th wedding anniversary in December 1899, as the 19th century drew to a close, their children threw them a surprise party. The house was full of people, friends and neighbors and distant relatives, all gathered to celebrate the couple who'd become something of a legend in Concord. The love story of the deputy and the boarding house owner who'd found each other during a bank robbery had been told and retold until it had taken on almost mythical proportions. During the party, Joseph stood and raised his glass. "I want to propose a toast to my parents. Growing up, I watched them build a life together based on love, respect, and commitment. They showed us that marriage isn't always easy, but it's always worth it when you choose the right person. They taught us to be kind, to work hard, to stand up for what's right, and to never take for granted the people we love. Papa, Mama, thank you for being the best example we could have asked for. Happy anniversary." Everyone raised their glasses and Grace felt tears slipping down her cheeks. She looked at Ben and saw that his eyes were moist too. They'd built something beautiful, not just a family but a legacy of love that would ripple out through generations. Later that night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Grace and Ben stood on their porch under a canopy of stars. It was cold, winter having fully arrived, but they stood close together, wrapped in a shared blanket. "You remember that day I asked you if you'd ever settle down?" Grace asked. Ben chuckled. "How could I forget? I'd been waiting for the right moment to tell you how I felt, and you just asked outright. It was very you. And you said you already had with me. I think that was the moment I knew for certain that we were going to spend the rest of our lives together." "I meant every word," Ben said. "That was the day I truly settled, not when I arrived in Concord or when I took the deputy position. It was when I told you the truth about my feelings, when I acknowledged that you were my home." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "We've built a good life, haven't we? The best life. Better than I ever dreamed possible. 5 wonderful children, a home I built with my own hands, work that matters, and you. Always you, Grace. You're still the best part of every day. I love you, Benjamin Irwin, just as much today as I did 25 years ago. Maybe more, because now I know what we're capable of creating together. I love you too, Grace Irwin, for the rest of my days and whatever comes after." They kissed, a kiss that held 25 years of love and passion and partnership. When they finally pulled apart, they stayed on the porch a while longer, reluctant to end such a perfect day. The new century brought changes to Concord and the world beyond. Automobiles began appearing on roads that had only known horses and wagons. Telephones connected people across vast distances. Women began demanding the right to vote, and Anna became active in the suffrage movement, making her parents proud even when others thought her radical. Ben finally retired from his position as deputy in 1905 at the age of 63, after 32 years in law enforcement. The town threw him a retirement party, and the new generation of lawmen spoke about his influence and the standard he'd set. He remained active, though, unable to sit still, helping around the house and property, spending time with his growing number of grandchildren. Joseph had married and had 3 children of his own, practicing law in Sacramento. Anna remained unmarried, dedicated to her teaching and activism. The twins had married sisters, confusing everyone at family gatherings, and between them had 7 children. Ruth married an artist she'd met at an exhibition in San Francisco, and they'd settled in Concord, wanting to raise their 2 children near family. Grace and Ben found themselves surrounded by grandchildren, the house once again filled with the laughter and chaos of young voices. They loved it, spoiling their grandchildren shamelessly and teaching them the same values they'd instilled in their own children. On a warm afternoon in June 1910, Grace and Ben celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The celebration was smaller than the 25th, a family gathering rather than a town-wide party. They were both 71 years old now, their bodies showing the wear of long lives well lived, but their minds were still sharp and their love undimmed. They sat together on the porch, the same spot they'd occupied thousands of times over the decades, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Someone asked them the secret to a long and happy marriage, and Grace and Ben looked at each other, entire conversations passing between them in a glance. "Choose each other every day," Grace said finally. "Even on the days when it's hard, especially on those days. Choose love over pride, kindness over being right, and always remember why you fell in love in the first place." Ben added, "And marry your best friend. Everything else gets easier when you genuinely like the person you're spending your life with." Grace has been my partner, my confidante, my greatest supporter, and my favorite person for 50 years. That's the real secret. They spent the rest of the afternoon reminiscing, telling stories that their children had heard 100 times but never tired of hearing. The story of the bank robbery and how they met. Their first dance at the Harvest Festival. The night they got engaged under the stars. The births of each of their children. The building of their home. A lifetime of moments, big and small, that added up to a beautiful whole. As the sun set and family members began heading home, Grace and Ben were left alone on the porch. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to deep blue. The air smelled of honeysuckle and roses from Grace's garden, and somewhere a mockingbird sang its complex evening song. "You have any regrets?" Grace asked quietly. Ben thought about it seriously before answering. "Not a single one. Every choice I made led me here to you, to this life." "How could I regret any of that? I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day, if you'd arrived in Concord a week earlier or later, if I'd chosen a different day to go to town. But I was there," Ben said firmly. "And you were there. And everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to. I don't believe in many things, Grace, but I believe we were meant to find each other." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, a position that felt as natural as breathing after 50 years. "Thank you for choosing me. For settling down with me. For giving me this beautiful life. Thank you for seeing something worth loving in a drifter with a gun and a badge. For taking a chance on me. For being the home I didn't know I was searching for." They sat there until the stars came out, and Grace thought about that young woman she'd been all those years ago, standing in the street after a bank robbery, offering a room to a stranger. She'd been brave then without knowing it, opening her heart to possibility despite her fear. And that decision, that single moment of courage, had given her everything she'd ever wanted, and so much more. Ben thought about the man he'd been, drifting and alone, convinced that he wasn't meant for the kind of life other people had. He'd been wrong, so wrong, and he was grateful every single day that fate or luck or God had brought him to Concord on that particular August morning in 1873. They lived 9 more years, dying within months of each other in 1919, having seen their grandchildren grow and great-grandchildren arrive. Grace went first, passing peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning, Ben's hand in hers. Ben followed in the autumn, his heart simply giving out one evening as he sat on their porch watching the sunset. The family agreed that he'd died of a broken heart, unable to live without his beloved Grace. They were buried side by side in the Concord cemetery, their graves marked with a simple stone that read, Benjamin and Grace Irwin, beloved husband and wife, together forever. Their children made sure fresh flowers always adorned the grave, and for years after, people would visit the site, remembering the love story that had become part of Concord's history. The house they'd built stood for generations, eventually becoming a historical landmark. The boarding house continued operating under various owners, always successful because of the foundation Grace had laid. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren spread out across California and beyond, carrying with them the values and love that Ben and Grace had instilled, proof that a life well lived ripples out in ways that can never be fully measured. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the story itself, the tale of 2 people who found each other at exactly the right moment and had the courage to build something beautiful together. It was told around dinner tables and at bedtimes, shared at weddings and anniversaries, a reminder that love, real love, is always worth the risk. That home isn't a place but a person. That settling down isn't giving up freedom but finding something better. And somewhere, in whatever lies beyond this life, Ben and Grace were together still, their love transcending even death, eternal as the California hills where they'd built their life, lasting as the stars under which they'd pledged forever. They'd started with a moment of violence and ended with a lifetime of love, proving that even in the rough and tumble world of the Wild West, even in times of uncertainty and hardship, love could bloom and flourish and create something that would outlast them both. Their story was romance in its truest form, not the fleeting passion that burns bright and quick, but the steady flame that warms through cold nights and lights the way through dark times. It was partnership and respect, laughter and tears, compromise and communication. It was choosing each other, over and over again, through 59 years of marriage and all the challenges those years brought. And it all began because a brave woman offered a stranger a room, and a wandering man finally found the place he was meant to be. It continued because they had the wisdom to recognize something precious when they found it and the courage to hold on tight. It endured because they understood that love isn't just a feeling but a choice, a commitment, a daily decision to put someone else's happiness alongside your own and to build something bigger than either of you alone. The cowboy had settled down, just as Grace had asked. And in settling, in choosing her and the life they built together, he found everything he'd been searching for without knowing it. She'd given him a home, and he'd given her adventure. She'd given him stability, and he'd given her passion. She'd given him family, and he'd given her security. Together, they'd given each other a love that became legendary, a story told and retold, inspiring others to believe that such love was possible, that it was real, that it was worth waiting for and fighting for and cherishing every single day. And in the end, that was their real gift to the world, not just the children they raised or the businesses they ran or the community they served, but the example they set. They showed that love, true love, the kind that lasts a lifetime and beyond, is not only possible but worth every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of vulnerability it requires. Ben had settled down with Grace, and in doing so had found not restriction but freedom. Freedom to be fully himself, to love completely, to build and create and become the man he was always meant to be. And Grace, in accepting his love and giving hers in return, had found not limitation but expansion. Her world had grown to include not just him but the beautiful family and life they created together. Their story ended as all stories must, with death separating them briefly before reuniting them forever. But the love they shared, the life they built, the legacy they left, that never ended. It lived on in every descendant who chose love over fear, in every person who heard their story and decided to take a chance on someone, in every moment when courage overcame doubt and hearts opened to possibility. The cowboy had settled down. The boarding house owner had found her partner. And together, they'd proven that sometimes the best endings are really just the beginning of something even better. They'd shown that home is where love lives, that family is what you build, and that settling down doesn't mean settling for less, but rather finding everything you never knew you needed. And so their story became part of the fabric of Concord, woven into the town's history as surely as the streets and buildings. Future generations would walk past the house Ben built and the boarding house Grace ran, would visit their graves and read the simple inscription, and would remember that once upon a time in the Wild West, two people found each other against all odds and created something beautiful that lasted long after they were gone. It was a story of its time but also timeless, as relevant in future centuries as it was in their own. Because love, real love, never goes out of style. The details change, the setting shifts, but the fundamental truth remains. When you find the person who feels like home, you hold on. You settle down, not because you have to, but because you can't imagine wanting to be anywhere else. You choose them every day, build a life together, weather the storms, and celebrate the sunshine. And if you're very lucky, you get 59 years of marriage and a lifetime of love that inspires others long after you're gone. Ben and Grace Irwin were that lucky. They found each other, recognized what they had, and had the wisdom and courage to nurture it into something extraordinary. And their story, from that first meeting during a bank robbery to their final days together watching the sunset from their porch, remained a testament to the power of love, the importance of choosing wisely, and the beautiful things that can grow when two people commit to building a life together. The cowboy settled down, and in settling he found everything: